in speaking to law students, one thing I always would tell them is, look, you're learning civil procedure, or you're learning criminal law, and it can seem arcane, thank you so much. It can seem arcane, right? These rules you're trying to learn. But I said, just remember that every case you ever have as a lawyer, whatever it is, there are people, there are impacts to that case on real people. And don't ever lose track of that. I think it's easy for lawyers to lose track of that. And so I always concluded my presentation with, after the first case we had against the administration was the first Muslim travel ban. And Washington was the first state to file a lawsuit challenging that, as you know. And we, thank you. And we won, and after that happened, I began receiving some letters, handwritten letters in the mail. And I remember the first day, my executive assistant said, hey, Bob, you've got some letters from people, and there's like 25 or 30 of them. And I thought, man, that's crazy that people would write about a case like that. So I remember thinking, well, if someone from my state, they came from all around, actually, and I thought, well, if people from my state handwrote a letter to me, I would handwrite a letter back. And so that became a thing that I did. And one of the letters that I received was from a kid, and she was the same age as my kids at the time. She was like 7 or 8. And she was from one of the countries impacted by the Muslim travel ban. She's from Iraq or Iran, as I recall. And I wish I had the image for you, but it's a kid writing, of course. I'm sure her parents put her up to it, but she drew like a cartoon picture of me, like in a cape, like a Superman cape, and she had an arrow to my arm, and it said M-U-S-S-E-L-L-S, muscles for my arm, right? and in her letter, which was so sweet, she wrote, because you stood up, I can be here. Which, when you think about it, like to me, I put that image up for the law students to see because, look, even a kid, right? The kid may not understand equal protection, due process, whatever those things are in the Constitution, but a kid understands an impact on where she can live. And that's based on a case using the Constitution where a kid who grew up on Queen Anne Hill, a few blocks away, can file a lawsuit against the president and stop an unconstitutional racist policy from being implemented, right? You can do that in our country because of that Constitution. I wanted those law students to see that, right? That every time you have a case, think about somebody who's impacted by that case. And so when I think what the Constitution means to me, I think a lot about that, right? That's what I try to communicate to my team when we have a case, is that there are real impacts. And that's the beauty of the play, right? It just brings that out, and I think that's often missing in law schools. I think it's often missing when lawyers like me talk about the law, is those impacts. And I think that's what to me resonates so deeply with the performance, is it draws that out in obviously painful ways and in joyous ways and all the things that comes through in the performance. I think that's what resonates most with me.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Oh, but by the way, I should mention, the first thing I'm gonna do when I walk out of here, though, is send a text to my chief deputy and say, we need to hire Leah as soon as we possibly can. That's the first thing I'm gonna do. I don't know if she's still in here, but that's the first thing we're gonna do. And Leah, if you're listening, the Washington AG's office has the best civil rights division of any office in the country. That's a fact, that's a fact. We'd love to have you.
Speaking of your office having the best civil rights team in the country, is there anything that your team is working on right now that you are willing or able to share that is either pertinent to the show or just very present on Washingtonians' minds?
Well, sure, there's always a lot, right, that's going on. And I guess what I would say that was something that was touched on in the show that's obviously extremely topical right now is reproductive freedom for women in our country and, of course, in our state in light of the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court overruling Roe v. Wade. So I guess what I would say about that is that, sometime before that decision came out, it seemed to me pretty clear that's what the Supreme Court was going to do. And so I began putting together a team in the office, much like we did after Donald Trump was elected, but before he took office, we began thinking about what kind of cases we may need to bring if he implemented policies that he said he would do as a candidate, right? And so we have about 20 folks in our office who work on these issues of reproductive freedom and thinking about situations to make sure that individuals in Washington are protected. If, for example, let's say you're an individual in Washington and you go across the border to Idaho to assist a friend with getting abortion by picking her up and driving her back across to Washington State and paying for the abortion, what legal, civil, or criminal implications could there be for that woman or the provider here in Washington if a state like Idaho adopts what more and more states are doing, which is extremely stringent, radical laws seeking to sanction individuals civilly or criminally for those kinds of actions. And so that's something we're spending a lot of time thinking about. From my perspective, obviously my job is to defend and enforce Washington state law. Thankfully, from my perspective, the people through the initiative process codified the protections of Roe v. Wade through the initiative process, that the people did that. And maybe just one more thing I'll sort of add in the conversation of constitutions is that this play was obviously about the federal constitution. We have a state constitution as well. That was adopted in 1889 by a group of white men, of course. And one thing that you probably all know is there's actually kind of a growing interest in state constitutions, in part because a state constitution cannot take away rights in the federal constitution, but it can add rights. Okay, you can have additional protections through a state constitution. And so in the context of Roe v. Wade, for example, it's certainly my belief, and my team's been spending a lot of time looking at our state constitution, because our state constitution actually has pretty strong privacy rights embedded in our state constitution, which is different than many other state constitutions. So think about how to have creative arguments if, for example, there's a national ban on abortion, right? God forbid from my perspective, but to make sure we're prepared for a worst case scenario, because as your attorney, I feel it's my job to be prepared for a worst case scenario. So if that was to happen, our team is ready to act.
Do you have a favorite amendment?
It's like asking if you have a favorite kid, right? So I don't have a favorite. I don't have no, I don't think I do. I guess what I would say is that, look, I'm no constitutional scholar, right? You want like my Solicitor General no Purcell for that, right? But obviously I think about the Constitution a lot. It's a big part of how I spend my time. And while I couldn't say there's a favorite, I will say that I am appreciative. Maybe I'll highlight two things. One is I do especially value the checks and balances inherent in the Constitution. I think that is, there's a genius there, I think, that more often than not does work. Number two, with specific amendments, I will say, the First Amendment, the freedom of speech is, I feel that now, in that, especially like in the 4 years of the Trump administration where, look, I could say what I wanted about the president, right? I could do that, and nobody was going to put me in jail, right? I wasn't jeopardizing not seeing my kids by filing lawsuits against the president and beating him almost every time, by the way. And I wasn't going to go to jail for that, right? And that, I don't take that for granted. I remember I was walking Katie, I was walking her home from school once when she was, during those years, she was little, and I remember talking about that, right? And I remember saying to her, hey, Katie, it's important that I could live in another country where I couldn't do that. She was asking about the work I was doing. I said, hey, there are a lot of countries where if I did that, they'd put me in jail. And I remember she said, well, what would you do if you lived in one of those countries? Would you still do it? And I remember not being sure how to answer that question, right? Because I said, well, it's hard, Katie, right? Because if I did it, they would put me in jail, and I wouldn't see you anymore, and I wouldn't see Jack, and I wouldn't see your mom, right? That'd be hard. So for me, I just really valued that during that time, that ability that I was free to do that, right? And people could support it or not support it, but I was free to do it, and I didn't have to worry about that. And so I don't have a favorite, but I will say during those years, that really resonated with me during that time.
Calling back to an earlier moment in the show, they talked a lot about the Ninth Amendment and how no one actually really knows what
Justice
the Ninth
Douglas,
Amendment is. Did you prepare for this?
No.
Okay, good. And I was like, oh no. Do you have any thoughts or opinions on the Ninth Amendment? If you don't know what the Ninth Amendment is, you have a handy-dandy pocket constitution.
The penumbra, right?
The penumbra.
Joe Biden's talked about the Ninth Amendment recently. So in law school, I don't recall it ever coming up. Maybe I'm wrong. I was pretty into constitutional law when I was in law school. Maybe it came up, I don't recall it. It's not a big focus typically in law school, at least when I went to law school. But it is, I think it was mentioned in the play that it's essentially, I think it's one sentence, and it essentially does contemplate arguably this idea that you can't write in every right that you have in the Constitution, so hey, this reserves other additional rights. And maybe what I would say about it is that, going back to maybe Roe v. Wade, that in thinking about the Constitution and this current Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court that we have and the challenges inherent with that court, is I do think it's incumbent upon lawyers like myself to utilize different parts of the Constitution maybe in different ways. And I do think that the Ninth Amendment has the potential, because of its openness to those additional rights, with the right court perhaps in the future. I don't think this current court is particularly interested in that, to be candid. But I do think that the Ninth Amendment has the potential to emerge in a more significant way than it currently is now. And that's, in some ways, with the Constitution, you see that as time goes on. There are some amendments that get virtually no attention, then time goes by and suddenly it gets a rebirth, right? And so I think that is possible with the Ninth Amendment.
We have time for a few audience questions. If you've been thinking it, all right, I see one up there.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
This might be a tough one. Do you think that there is a possibility that we could use the Constitution to solve America's poverty problem?
So the question is, that is a tough one. So the question is, do I think there's a possibility of using the Constitution to solve America's poverty problem? Well, I mean, maybe this takes us back to the Ninth Amendment, right? That that is a type of amendment you would turn to try and address something like that. Certain rights that aren't spelled out somewhere else in the Constitution, that you could use an amendment like that. I guess a couple things I would say is you would need to have a court that's receptive to that. By a court, say the U.S. Supreme Court. You know, to be candid, my really sophisticated analysis of the U.S. Supreme Court and the work that I do, and I've told my team this, and it's not really a joke when I say this to my team, but I say my goal right now with the current Supreme Court is to avoid having any case that we care about as a state appear before the U.S. Supreme Court, right? That is literally my approach on it. I do avoid it at all costs. And so you would need to have some things come together for that to happen. What I would say, though, is that it may seem that folks don't think about solving that problem through the Constitution, but that was the case for you name the issue, right? You name the issue where at one time it may not have seemed possible, but as time goes on, lawyers get creative, they make their arguments, and that can happen. So, but I think, again, maybe even looking at the Ninth Amendment for something like that would be possible. By the way, I should mention, by the way, before I forget, my sister and my brother-in-law are here, and so I'm mentioning my sister Ann because, well, they both have theater, history, and drama degrees, PhD for my sister. So that's right, that counts, right? I've got theater, history, and drama in my family. But most impressively, my way here, she called me up and she said that she came to the first ever performance at the Seattle Rep when she was 9 years old. King Lear, she was here for it with my dad. So there you go. So Seattle Rep, we love the Seattle Rep, yeah.
Any additional right there in the middle?
I have some concerns that more of the hospitals in the in Washington State are being run under the umbrella of the Catholic Church. And so does that limit and that they may not follow our Constitution in allowing abortions?
Yeah, so I'll just repeat the question for everybody. So the question goes to many hospitals here in Washington, but across the country, are owned by the Catholic Church and operated by the Catholic Church. And the impact that could have on reproductive health options for women here in Washington, or presumably in other states as well. And I think just the open-ended question of what that might mean. So speaking as a Catholic, I agree with you that is a concern. So I think maybe I can speak a little bit more broadly about it, is with this court in particular, and this has been coming for some time, I think, in the courts, is the intersection of religious freedom. In many contexts, you've pointed on one very specifically. We're seeing it played out at SPU, for example, right? They're in the news right now. The football coach at the high school praying on and on and on, right? And that is a challenge, right? That balancing out, I'm Catholic, my right to, we just were in church the other day, right? That religious freedom we have, but also when that religious freedom impairs a right you have, right? Whatever that may be. In this case, we're talking about the right for reproductive choices. And so, you know, I think what you'll see more and more is the court seems willing to take on those cases and rule in those cases. I think the court has a certain orientation when it comes to those. That may not be the one that you in particular, or I wouldn't necessarily agree with. You know, my job as Attorney General, we've not had a direct case on that necessarily that's come up. But if you want to sort of do a deep dive on it, we do issue AG opinions on issues that come up from time to time. So we did a number of years ago issue an AG opinion that's quite lengthy and more detailed than we probably want to get into here. But if you're interested, if you simply research my name, that issue, and hospitals here in Washington State, we issued that opinion several years ago. You'd probably get more information you possibly would ever want to know, but it will lay out at least sort of the state of the law on where things are at currently. But again, things are evolving quickly when it comes to those issues, and that one in particular.
Thank you. And hold on, I'm looking up. I see someone. Yeah, they sure are. Someone way up in the back there.
Can you foresee any successful constitutional challenge to Citizens United?
The question is, yeah, right, we can apply that, right? Do I foresee any successful challenges to Citizens United? Look, before I give my one-word answer, I just will share with you, I try to be very realistic about things and practical about things, and the answer is no. No, I don't. And that's not the answer I want to give you, but it is most certainly the case. There is zero chance this court is interested in changing that. Zero chance. In fact, a fair amount of my attention when it comes to sort of transparency in elections and those issues is actually defending and enforcing Washington State's quite robust law around these issues. So once again, going back to the people, Jolene Unsold, and a former congresswoman, but long before she was a congresswoman, she was a citizen activist, and she and a number of other citizen activists, like in 1972 or many, many years ago, put an initiative on the ballot that passed that set in place our framework for transparency in our elections. We actually have had litigation to, in fact, we have a case right now against Facebook for them not following the law on, long story very short, if you see a TV ad, a political ad, excuse me, on a TV station, you can go to Cairo TV and ask for the information about who's paying for that ad, how much are they paying for the ad, who the contact information is, how many points they're buying for the ad, radio station, newspapers, you name it. Well, campaigns buy political ads, for example, on social media. Facebook did not want to follow that law. We filed a lawsuit against them, and they responded by bringing a bunch of DC lawyers and challenging the constitutionality of that law that you all put in place. Thankfully, my team beat those DC lawyers about a week ago, right? That's the good news. And I've asked the court to issue the maximum fine against Facebook, which would be $24.6 million. Not that I'm counting every dollar, but it's $24.6 million would be the maximum penalty. So, but that is something that we have that's actually is important, right? It doesn't solve all the problems of Citizens United, not by a long shot with dark money and having been the recipient of millions of dollars of political tax paid for by dark money. I can appreciate the importance of what Citizens United did and what it did not do. And so, but I don't see a change. I'm sorry for the longer answer, but from a practical standpoint, no. But there are state laws like Washington's that can help on those issues and provide transparency, and it's my job to defend those.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions. Got one over here.
So the rate at which amendments are passed seems to have reduced.
Yeah.
Do you have any hope that we will see more amendments to fix any of the remaining issues along nicely the Constitution?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, it's been a long time since a meaningful amendment has passed the Constitution. I think it's been 50 years, almost as long as I've been alive, since a sort of meaningful amendment has passed the Constitution. Do I see any change in that coming? Sorry to be the short one-word no answer, but the answer is no. I'll just be honest, it's no. It's so hard to alter the Constitution. And well, look, on the debate, which was fascinating, the debate at the end of the play, I'm firmly in the camp of, hey, keeping the Constitution. That said, a key challenge I see with it is the singular inability as a country to make changes to it, because the burden is so high to pass Congress and pass the states. That is a huge, huge challenge. But no, I don't see changes. And look, that would have been my answer probably 10 years ago, but it would have been maybe a little less certain than it is now. And I think the reason it's more firmly grounded as being a no is what you all see, what you all know. I'm not telling you that you don't know, but our country is so divided. And the number of states you need to pass an amendment along the type that we're talking about, presumably that would be significant, meaningful change in given the direction on some of the court cases in the Supreme Court, that I do not see that happening, no.
All right, one last question.
Last question's always the trickiest. Who's got the last one?
This one right over here.
Hi, I was wondering what your opinion on the recent win against the Jewel lawsuit is?
Yeah, so the question goes to a lawsuit we had against Jewel. Juul's a large corporation that that creates vaping products that are overutilized by young people, obviously. And so we filed a lawsuit against Juul that recently settled, and they're paying, I want to say it's like $26 million or something at the state of Washington. That money to be used for the state to help with avoid kids getting addicted to their products. So we're one state. Other states have filed their own lawsuits as well. I guess what I just would say about that, sort of at a high level, is you know, once again, in thinking about cases as having impact on real people, you know, vaping has become so ubiquitous in our high schools. And if you got kids or grandkids out there, or nieces or nephews, I mean, talk to them about it. You know, it's a huge challenge, and the addiction issues we see with that are huge. And so for me, what the case was basically about was them being aware of some of these issues, but obviously advertising and promoting their products in a way that was deceptive and underplaying the addictive qualities. That's why we filed a lawsuit and had the large recovery we did. And so, you know, part of my job, I guess, as we start to wrap up, is this isn't necessarily sort of constitutional, but is a big part of, is if you are an individual in Washington, what are your chances of suing Juul, right? From a practical standpoint, or any large corporation that violates the law. It's extremely difficult. There are many wonderful things about our system of government, about the rule of law, but as I tell law students all the time, right, the law is only meaningful if you have someone who can advocate and knows how to advocate on your behalf, right? And so it's why I often encourage law students to go into public service, right? In public service, like Leah, right? Like you can go into public service and she can use her considerable talents to be that advocate for folks. And that's where we come in, right? We can take on powerful corporations like Facebook or like Juul. That an individual from a practical standpoint are really, really limited, but we can do that on their behalf. And I have to say that is one of the more rewarding parts of the job is being able to do that. Yeah. And so maybe just, yeah, thanks. And so maybe just a final thought. I just will say, look, it's a really challenging time in our country right now. And I'm a glass half full kind of person. I'll confess that right from the get-go. But I really do worry about the future of our country for my kids, right? And that I just don't take for granted anymore that they will be raised in the kind of democracy that I was raised in. I'm not naive to that anymore. And I never thought I would ever, honestly, I mean, I wouldn't have thought I would ever say that to an audience of people here not far from where I grew up. But I really believe that to be true. And I guess what I would say is that I liked what Leah said I think it was in her close, where she said, hey, you know, it's incumbent upon all of us, right, to do our part, whatever that part is, right? Whatever it is we can do, we all have a job to do. And I really believe it to be a job, sort of our duty to do what we can to preserve what is good about the Constitution and seek to change what needs to be changed at the Constitution or with our courts or with the big lie. And I believe there's a direct line from the big lie to being an existential threat to our republic and our government. And so, you know, I guess what I would say is your Attorney General, I really view that as, you know, if you ask me what I think about every day, yes, it's the Constitution, and it's how to use, with the wonderful people in my office who, my God, could make a whole lot more money at a big private law firm, right, than the money that we were able to pay them you're able to pay them in the AG's office. But I do view that as sort of fundamental to our work and what we do, and I know my team feels that very deeply. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah.